Hi everyone. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the light and maybe turn a fan on for that calming sound. Picture this. You're a medieval assassin creeping through twisted shadows, the target finally in sight. But this isn't the start of a success story. It's the beginning of a life spent running from betrayed clients, angry nobles, and sometimes even the people who hired you. How did it get this bad? Let's talk about it. Forget everything Hollywood's ever shown you about assassins. No secret handshakes, no elaborate training rituals, and definitely no sleek leather outfits. The popular image of these shadowy killers as part of an elite underground network couldn't be further from reality. The truth. Most medieval assassins were the last people you'd expect. Thrust into the profession not because they wanted glory or riches, but because they were out of options. These weren't skilled professionals honing their craft in secret chambers. They were desperate individuals, scraping by in societies that barely cared if they lived or died. We tend to imagine assassins as something out of a fantasy, dedicated, methodical, and sworn to silence, like they took an oath under the stars or something. In medieval Europe, though, the story was far less glamorous. Your average assassin could have just as easily been a starving peasant, a disgraced soldier, or a pickpocket looking for a payday. Some were former mercenaries, too wounded or burned out to survive traditional battlefields. Others were prisoners forced into service, released only long enough to complete a dirty job before vanishing again, if they were lucky, that is. And training. Forget about it. Nobody sat these people down and said, "Here's how to sneak into a castle," or "This is the best way to handle a poisoned dagger." They didn't have master assassins teaching them how to move undetected or which tools work best. Most of them didn't even know what they were doing. Missions relied less on planning and more on sheer gut instinct. Imagine someone handing you a rusty sword and saying, "Go take down the local lord." That's about as much preparation as they usually got. The tools of the trade weren't much better. A fancy hidden blade. Maybe a sharp kitchen knife if they were lucky enough to nick one from the village butcher. Poisons existed, of course, but only the rudimentary kinds, often homemade and wildly unreliable. These were concoctions assembled with borrowed knowledge and guesswork. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it just gave the target a nasty stomachache. Assassination wasn't clean or precise, not by any stretch. It was messy, dangerous, and often just as much of a gamble for the assassin as it was for their target. Now, why would anyone risk such a bleak profession? That's the part that makes medieval assassins so painfully human. They usually didn't have a choice. Societal structures back then didn't give the lower classes many ways to climb out of poverty. If you were a poor farmer with a bad season, you were stuck. If you were a soldier who had been dismissed, injured, or accused of cowardice, you were worse than stuck. You were a societal outcast. And if you were already involved in petty crimes, a hired assassination might have felt like the next step up, even if it wasn't. History shows us just how little these assassins were valued by the same people who hired them. They were treated not like people, but like tools, easily replaceable, easily disposed of. Nobles or rival factions who employed them made promises of money or power, but had no intention of fulfilling those promises. And why would they? Who's going to believe a known killer over a rich and well-connected lord? Trust was non-existent in this line of work, which meant betrayal was a guarantee. Even successful assassins often didn't live long enough to enjoy the rewards they were promised. If they weren't killed outright during their missions, they might be turned in by their employers once the job was done, just to tie up loose ends. And let's get real. Success didn't mean what you think it did. Imagine for a second that things went perfectly. The assassin sneaks in, eliminates the target, sneaks back out, and survives the night. Congratulations, right? Wrong. That assassin would have a new nightmare waiting for them by morning. Without any formal organization or guild to protect their identity or offer a safe escape, they had to fend for themselves. How do you think you'd avoid the wrath of an entire lord's household or the suspicion of the next village once word spread? There was no celebration, no grand reward. Once the job was done, they usually had to leave the area entirely, start over, and hope nobody recognized them. What's more heartbreaking is how short their actual careers usually were. For some, it was a one-time gig, a desperate act to buy food for their families or pay off a debt. For others, it lasted only as long as their luck did. One mistake was all it took. Failure meant getting caught, and getting caught often meant a public and brutal death. But even success didn't guarantee survival. The people who hired them might have tipped off local authorities accidentally, or rivals could trace the assassin's work back to them. In a way, their lives were a constant tightrope walk between life and death, with almost no room for missteps. And as bleak as all this sounds, it's worth considering why they'd take these risks in the first place. The medieval world wasn't exactly forgiving. If a drought wiped out a harvest, people starved. If a war broke out, peasants were the first to suffer. There was no safety net, especially for those born at the bottom. Becoming an assassin was rarely a deliberate career path. It was survival, plain and simple. It's easy to picture assassins as loners, but they weren't born that way. Societal rejection forced them into isolation. Even their limited success came at a cost. Assassins couldn't afford friends, allies, or long-term relationships. Frankly, their reputation made it impossible. Who'd trust someone with rumors of murder following them from town to town? Even the underworld, a space where you might think assassins would find camaraderie, had little room for them. Thieves and bandits might have worked together, pooling resources for more ambitious heists. But assassins were treated like ticking time bombs. Regular criminals avoided them out of fear and suspicion, knowing their very presence could bring unwanted heat. When you add all of this up, it's no wonder survival rates were so low. And those that did manage to avoid an early death weren't much better off. They spent their lives always looking over their shoulders, never stopping long enough to enjoy the quiet safety they probably craved. Their survival was never guaranteed. And peace? That was out of the question. But at this point, you're probably wondering, with nothing going for them, the lack of training, resources, protection, or even a slim shred of trust, how did medieval assassins even survive the job? Let's head into that next. Imagine this. Someone hands you a dagger one day and says, "Good luck." No instructions, no tips, no team to guide you. Somehow, you're supposed to sneak into a heavily guarded space, eliminate a target, and escape to tell the tale. That was the reality of a medieval assassin's training. Well, calling it training might be giving it too much credit. If you learned anything at all, it was usually the result of surviving your first attempt. Everything else, pure trial and error. Here's the thing. There was no handbook for this kind of work. Unlike what the movies would have you believe, assassins weren't part of some ancient organization passing down centuries of elite knowledge. You didn't get years of preparation in stealth or combat. Most assassins began with exactly one qualification. They were desperate enough to try. New recruits, if you could even call them that, weren't guided by mentors in darkened halls or drilled in sophisticated techniques. Instead, their education was what you might call on the job. If you failed, you didn't get another lesson. You didn't even get another day. And let's not forget the tools, or lack thereof. A medieval assassin's toolbox was embarrassingly bare. Forget fancy equipment or custom weapons. What they had was whatever they could steal, scavenge, or improvise from everyday objects. Daggers were a popular choice, but hardly reliable. The blade you carried might be dull, rusted, or poorly balanced, and that's if you even had one to begin with. Sometimes they'd make do with garrots cobbled together from rope or wire. Other times, a sharpened piece of metal, a broken shard of glass, or even a heavy rock had to suffice. It wasn't what you'd call efficient, and it certainly wasn't glamorous. And poison? Ah yes, the assassin's signature tool in stories. In reality, it was about as reliable as flipping a coin. Poisons weren't professionally crafted concoctions. They were crude blends of whatever toxic plants, minerals, or even animal parts could be scrounged up. Think bits of hemlock, arsenic dust, or, if you really want to get medieval, toad guts. Dosages were a guessing game. Sometimes, you'd mix something just toxic enough to make the target vomit, blow their cover, and increase suspicion rather than eliminate them. If it didn't outright kill, things got ugly. You might think someone with military experience, the ability to fight, wield weapons, or strategize, would have an edge in this line of work. And in some cases, it helped. Maybe an ex-soldier knew how to hold a knife or disarm a guard. But here's the catch. Nothing about being on a battlefield prepared you for assassination. Soldiers were taught to work in teams, to follow orders, and to deal with enemies in the open. Assassins, by contrast, were on their own, expected to operate quietly, invisibly, and without backup. A soldier's instinct might be to charge or defend, a strategy that gets you killed when the only objective is to disappear before anyone notices you. To make matters worse, stealth wasn't exactly an innate skill for most people. You didn't get lessons in moving silently or hiding in plain sight. Slipping through shadows, improvising a disguise. That took time to figure out, if you lived long enough. The first few jobs were usually disastrous trial runs. You might knock over a lantern sneaking through a hallway or get caught because you forgot to wipe muddy footprints. The learning curve was steep, and failure wasn't like failing a class. It was more permanent. Let's say you made it as far as reaching your target. The struggle didn't end there. With unreliable weapons and barely any training, you had to kill fast and quietly. Two things that didn't always go hand in hand. A single miscalculation, even the wrong kind of stab, could turn a clean hit into a drawn-out struggle. If the target struggled or made noise, guards were alerted, and your mission was over before it even began. For these assassins, getting in and out clean wasn't a matter of skill. It was sheer luck, and luck played a role in almost every part of the job. Finding tools, figuring out poisons, or even guessing when and where a target would be vulnerable. None of it followed some brilliant master plan. You'd stake out a place, maybe steal some scraps of information, and hope it all came together at the right moment. Sometimes it did. Other times, you walked into a trap or found yourself improvising wildly just to escape alive. Survival wasn't about strategy. It was about making do with whatever scraps of opportunity existed. The odds weren't great, Think about the sheer pressure of one of these missions. Every single action, from slipping past guards to actually carrying out the kill, was a high-stakes gamble where any mistake could lead to capture. And in the medieval world, getting caught wasn't just life-ending. It was public and horrific. A failed assassin didn't just lose their life. They became a gruesome spectacle, a warning to others not to try their hand at the same dangerous trade. The stakes couldn't get much higher. Even the environment worked against them. Castles, forts, and estates weren't exactly designed with ease of access in mind. Navigating these spaces meant dealing with locked doors, iron gates, and watchful guards strategically placed to spot intruders. And while stealth might work in the dead of night, many assassins didn't get that luxury. Sometimes you had to attempt an attack in broad daylight, relying on disguises that only worked if no one looked too closely, which, as you can imagine, wasn't very often. And of course, there's the human factor. Assassins weren't robots. They panicked, they hesitated, they made errors. Maybe they moved too soon or waited too long. Maybe they underestimated a guard or misjudged the target's routine. Every second, every step was a chance for something to go wrong. And more often than not, something did. The lack of preparation turned every job into a coin toss. With your life depending on how it landed, every tool you carried could fail. Every plan you made could fall apart. Survival felt less like an achievement and more like a fluke. There was no backup, no redo, no second chances. Assassins only got as far as their luck carried them, and when that ran out, so did they. The reality of their tools and training, or the absence of both, only added to the impossible odds they faced. Crude weapons, unreliable methods, no formal instruction, and constant danger. Their lives were defined by resourcefulness, desperation, and a whole lot of risk. The truth is, they weren't the silent professionals of legend. They were people scrambling in a chaotic world, often one step away from death. And yet, as if this wasn't enough, there was one final twist in their short, grim careers: betrayal. We've talked about the dangers of the job itself, but what about the people who hired them? The truth is, clients weren't always as trustworthy as they seemed, if they seemed trustworthy at all. Let's look at how trust, or the lack of it, ruled their lives. The people who hired assassins during the Middle Ages were often the same people plotting their downfall. It's ironic, really. The person handing over a job also had a knife ready to stick in the back of the assassin the moment they were no longer useful. If you thought sneaking into a heavily guarded castle was dangerous, imagine working for someone who saw you as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Nobles, bishops, merchants, rival factions. They were the usual clients, and despite all their power, they rarely felt any loyalty toward the people they hired for these dirty jobs. Why would they? You don't need to keep a tool around after it's done the job. Here's how it worked. Say a baron needed to remove another lord who'd been encroaching on their land. They couldn't just launch an all-out attack, not without drawing attention from the king or the church, both of whom didn't take kindly to open warfare among their subjects. Hiring an assassin solved that problem, in theory. A few coins exchanged in the shadows, a vague promise of more once the deed was done, and the baron could sit back while their rival suddenly disappeared. This was a convenient solution for one party, the one sitting comfortably in a stone manor while someone else risked their life. The assassin, meanwhile, got the short end of the deal. They had to trust a client who, in most cases, would rather not have to pay them at all. Why shell out serious money when it's so much easier to eliminate the person demanding it? If the assassin managed to complete the job, And that was a big if. They'd often find themselves staring down the business end of a sword when they came to collect their reward. Betrayal wasn't just a possibility, it was practically the rule. And there were no refunds or do-overs. The phrase, "when the job is done," usually translated to, "after we've decided whether or not you're worth keeping alive." For the clients, this relationship worked perfectly. Assassins were disposable by design, seen as tools rather than people. Nobles and merchants understood that keeping an assassin around was risky. What if they talked? What if they decided to switch sides for a better offer? The safest solution was to get rid of them as soon as the target had been dealt with. In some cases, clients went as far as hiring a second assassin to take out the first. Imagine that. Finishing a job and realizing the person you worked for had already planted a trap for you. It wasn't paranoia. It was common sense for anyone on the receiving end of these deals. And yet, for assassins, the temptation of even the slimmest chance at payment kept them coming back. They didn't exactly have many options. Payment in silver or gold might have been enough to start a new life, or, at the very least, keep food on the table for a while. But the reward was rarely as grand as promised, assuming they even got paid. More often than not, what awaited was a handful of coins, barely enough to justify the risk of being hunted, caught, or killed. The phrase "live on broken promises" wasn't just poetic. It was their entire profession reduced to a single grim reality. Some contracts were traps from the start. The assassin might be hired to take out a dangerous enemy, only to arrive and find themselves walking into an ambush. A decoy target, surrounded by armed guards, would expose the assassin and ensure their swift execution. The clients in these scenarios weren't careless or forgetful. They were playing politics. By dangling the promise of payment, they could rid themselves of two problems at once, the target and the assassin. And the best part, for them, nobody would take the assassin's side. No one mourned a killer for hire. If anything, the public spectacle of their capture and execution sent a neat little message. Don't mess with the people in power. Even when everything went right, if the job was completed and the assassin made it out alive, their problems were far from over. They couldn't exactly flaunt their earnings or stick around to enjoy them. The same person who had hired them might decide days or weeks later that they weren't comfortable with a loose thread walking around. Successful assassins were forced to vanish. Change your name, change your appearance, leave town before anyone connected you to the crime, and hope that nobody else decided to collect a bounty on your head in the meantime. It wasn't just the fear of being hunted. It was the sheer instability of a career that demanded constant reinvention. Start over again and again until the stress finally caught up or the odds stopped favoring you. This constant cycle, work, betrayal, flee, wasn't accidental. It was built into the medieval system. In a world where power dictated everything, trust was a foolish luxury. The nobility and clergy held all the cards. An assassin, for all their daring, was just another expendable pawn. And pawns didn't stick around to enjoy the safety of the board. If anything, they were swept off it the moment they outlived their usefulness. Speaking of trust, there's one thing an assassin could never afford to do: push back. Blackmail, for example, might seem like a reasonable tactic. You just finished a job for a powerful client, and they're refusing to pay. Threaten to expose them, right? Wrong. Blackmail wasn't an option. It was a death sentence. Nobles didn't negotiate with assassins. They had armies, informants, and no shortage of money to hire someone else to deal with the problem. Even the hint of betrayal from an assassin meant they wouldn't live to see the next town. You could threaten a tavern keeper or a disgraced merchant, but going toe-to-toe with someone who had both wealth and influence, that was suicide. The motivations of the clients varied, but they always came with strings attached. Sometimes it was about consolidating power. A rival baron needed to be removed before a piece of land could change hands. Other times, it was petty revenge, like a merchant taking out a competitor who was undercutting their prices. Then there were the bigger jobs, the kind meant to destabilize entire regions. A king's counselor, a high-ranking bishop, maybe even minor royalty. The assassin, in theory, would get a bigger payday for these targets. But in reality, the danger scaled with the reward. The more important the target, the more heavily guarded they were, and the harder it was to disappear afterward. In the end, the relationship between assassins and their clients was painfully one-sided. For the assassin, it was a gamble with almost no chance of reward. For the client, it was a transaction that left them in complete control. Even the most successful assassins, those who survived multiple jobs, knew better than to trust anyone who handed them work. Success in their world wasn't about recognition or glory. It wasn't even about the money. It was about getting to the end of the job alive and staying one step ahead of whoever was holding the knife next. Trust was a lie, betrayal was inevitable, and survival required constant vigilance. If the tools of their trade didn't fail them, their clients most certainly would. Every relationship had an expiration date, and sometimes that date arrived far sooner than expected. You might wonder, how did they navigate the constant danger, not just from their missions, but also from the very world they operated in? Let's look at the way they relied on deception and disguise to survive, even if just barely. The best disguise for a medieval assassin. Honestly, it wasn't about looking clever or cool. It was about not looking like anyone at all. The goal was to blend in so thoroughly that no one cared to give you a second glance. It's not like they had costume departments or endless resources to craft the perfect look. Most disguises were just cobbled together from whatever a person could scavenge, steal, or piece together through sheer desperation. But even with those efforts, passing unnoticed in medieval towns and courts was no easy feat, especially when everybody seemed to know everyone else. Let's start with this reality. Small medieval communities didn't exactly make anonymity easy. In close-knit villages, even being a friendly stranger would draw attention, much less a nervous outsider darting from shadow to shadow. You couldn't just walk into a place and assume no one would notice. People weren't glued to phones or distracted by big city noise. This was a world where strangers stood out. The local baker probably knew the names of everyone buying his stale bread, and a single unfamiliar face could set off alarm bells, even without a weapon poking out of their waistband. To avoid this, assassins leaned into the cheapest disguise possible. They became the everyman, or, more accurately, the nobody. You might find one dressed in a tattered peasant's outfit, the kind no one wanted to get too close to because it looked and smelled like it hadn't been washed in weeks. A dirty face, calloused hands, and a slight limp from old injuries. Perfect. That's just another farmer hauling sacks of who cares across the marketplace. Or maybe they'd pose as a monk, wrapped in a robe that was just a little too baggy and clutching onto prayer beads like they were afraid someone might question their holiness. These disguises weren't exactly masterpieces of subtlety, but they often worked because they drew on assumptions about class. In medieval society, appearances mattered. If you looked like a wealthy merchant or a minor noble, people noticed. But if you looked like a sickly goat herder who smelled faintly of turnips, no one gave you a second thought. Blending into the lower classes wasn't foolproof, though. It came with its own set of challenges, especially since servants were excellent at sniffing out anyone who didn't belong. Imagine trying to pass as part of the help in a lord's manor, only for someone to ask you where the cook's cat likes to sleep. If you couldn't answer, you didn't just blow your cover, you also painted a target on your back. Now, face coverings, those dramatic masks or veils you see in movies, seem like they'd be a natural choice, right? But here's the problem. Covering your face in most medieval towns made you stand out. A hood or scarf might be fine in the cold, but a full mask? You might as well tattoo "I'm suspicious" across your forehead. If someone did cover their face entirely, they risked being mistaken for a leper. And while that meant most people wouldn't want to touch them, it also meant they couldn't linger without raising questions. The goal wasn't to scream mystery or danger. The goal was to blend so thoroughly into the everyday background noise that no one even remembered seeing you. Of course, even a good disguise could only get you so far. Assassins had to sell the character they were playing, and that often meant fabricating an entire story to go along with it. Someone might claim to be a traveling merchant, hauling cheap fabrics or dyer's stains on their way to the next town. They'd mutter vague responses about their trade. "This old carpet. Oh yes, it's, imported." Or scrape together religious excuses when questioned. "Yes, Brother Tobias," they might say solemnly, "devoted to silent prayer and, rooftop maintenance." Lies like this only worked if you didn't overthink them, but they bought just enough time for the assassin to move on. The trouble was, even when a disguise worked, keeping the act together for hours, or even days, was a different story. Picture this. You're standing in a crowded banquet hall. Your target is just across the room, sipping wine and laughing with courtiers. You're dressed as a servant, pretending to be completely uninterested in everything, memorizing every move your target makes. And then someone asks you, "Hey, where's the bread tray supposed to go?" If you fumble or hesitate for even a moment, if you don't know exactly how to mimic the other servants, you're done. The smallest slip could blow your cover. Speaking of blending in, let's talk about class. An assassin's ability to pass unnoticed often hinged on how well they could mimic different social roles. Posing as a peasant or a common worker was one thing. Posing as someone who belonged in a noble household was something else entirely. Wealthy households trained their servants to notice details. An assassin trying to infiltrate a manor might be spotted immediately if they placed a goblet on the wrong side of a table or failed to bow deeply enough to the master of the house. These were the kinds of mistakes that cost far more than a scolding. There were also practical limits to what a disguise could achieve. Medieval assassins didn't have Hollywood-worthy wigs or prosthetics. If you wanted to look older or cover up scars, you got creative. Maybe you rubbed dirt into your face or smeared on soot to look grizzled. Need a beard? Better hope no one got close enough to figure out it was stuck on with honey. These tricks worked from a distance, but fell apart under scrutiny. If someone got too close, the game was over. Even the best disguises were temporary. They were meant to buy moments of confusion, not long-term invisibility. Once the attack was carried out, staying in character wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. At that point, the disguise wasn't enough to save you. You had minutes, maybe seconds, to disappear completely. That's where the real art of being an assassin came in. The most effective strategy wasn't to maintain a perfect persona. It was to become a ghost. Assassins planned their routes out of town ahead of the job, knowing they'd need to vanish immediately. They'd shed their disguise, ditch incriminating items, and slip into the shadows, moving on to a new identity and a new town as quickly as they'd arrived. Failure wasn't forgiving. If someone saw through your disguise before or after the attack, there was no second chance. The moment suspicion fell on you, the odds of escape dropped to almost nothing. Getting caught meant public punishment, horses drawn into elaborate executions, or, at the very least, a noose in front of the townsfolk. A bad disguise didn't just cost the mission. It cost the assassin's life and quite possibly their reputation as well. Nobody wanted to hire the guy who got caught while claiming to be a leper selling holy water. And yet, despite all of this, medieval assassins relied on disguises because they had no other tools to protect themselves. Their best weapon wasn't their blade or poison. It was their ability to become invisible. When clothes and stories failed, their only option was speed. Run, disappear, keep moving, keep lying, and never, ever look back. But what about the targets themselves? When the disguises worked and the assassin came close enough to strike, they had one final challenge: actually reaching someone who, for all intents and purposes, lived in a fortress designed to keep threats exactly like them out. Let's take a look at the obstacles standing between assassins and their targets. Their targets weren't just people. They were practically fortresses on legs. Nobles, bishops, kings, and military leaders weren't easy to reach in any sense of the word. Killing someone who mattered, and by mattered, I mean someone who could pay for a small army to protect them, wasn't as simple as sneaking up and letting a blade do the talking. These people lived behind walls, gates, and guards so thick, it might as well have been a game of how many layers can we stack to stay alive. For good reason too. The higher up you climbed the social ladder, the more enemies you had, and the more determined you were to sleep soundly at night. The targets medieval assassins were hired to eliminate weren't drunkards stumbling home after tavern fights. They were important enough to keep half the local population employed just to protect them. Nobles, for example, were a top pick. Some baron with a grudge would pay to knock off another baron, whose sheep grazed one step too far onto the wrong pasture. Bishops, too, often found themselves on hit lists. Install a corrupt man of God, and suddenly everyone you've ever slighted wants divine justice delivered with a knife. And then there were kings, or more commonly, their advisors. While royals were harder to physically access due to their paranoid levels of protection, high-ranking counselors, military officers, or even wealthy merchants all made suitable and slightly more reachable targets. The assassin wasn't just after an individual. They were targeting the very structure of power itself, which meant all the weight of that power pushed back against them. Getting to any of these people was almost impossible unless you were prepared to navigate a labyrinth of physical and psychological obstacles. Castles and manors weren't just places to live. They were fortresses where every door, window, and hallway was designed to funnel intruders into traps. Gatehouses, for example, weren't just a grand front entrance. They were heavily fortified bottlenecks, featuring thick wooden doors, iron portcullises, and narrow murder holes where defenders could rain down boiling oil, or whatever other nasty concoction they felt like whipping up that day. Then there was the moat. A classic, sure, but it did the job. Most were filled with water, though some added unhelpful extras like jagged stakes. Crossing one undetected, not exactly a walk in the park. Let's say you managed to get through all that. Congratulations. Now you're in the middle of a maze. Castles were intentionally designed to confuse intruders with winding hallways, hidden passages and dead ends. These weren't accidents or architectural quirks. They were defensive features built to buy time for guards to get into position. This meant that assassins often spent days, even weeks, studying layouts and routines. They learned which door creaked too loudly, how fast the guards on shift paced their routes, or exactly which stair squeaked under the weight of a boot. This wasn't just an idle pastime. It was their survival. A single misstep could signal the beginning of the end. Of course, the guards weren't exactly slacking on the job either. Castles and manors were swarming with armed men whose entire livelihood depended on keeping their employers alive. These weren't lazy night watchmen snoozing on the job. They were trained killers themselves, trusted to spot anything amiss. And if your life as an assassin wasn't tricky enough, you had to consider the human element, patterns, noises, and behaviors. Guards weren't just barriers. They were predators hunting for intruders, and you, desperate, fretting, caught in the wrong shadow, were the prey. Even worse, the staff inside the castle posed just as much of a threat as the sword-wielding guards outside of it. Servants, cooks, stable boys, and even laundry maids moved around like clockwork. They knew every face that belonged there and every schedule down to the last second. If you were out of place for even a moment, too clean to be shoveling manure, too awkward to be a real kitchen hand, someone would notice. And once a servant raised the alarm, there was no going back. Even medieval gossip moved faster than you could run, and the consequences of being caught were brutal. All of this was before you even got close to the target. Nobles weren't just guarded by walls. They were guarded by their own paranoia. Let's be honest. Living in a system built on betrayal and rivalries made people a bit on edge. These were folks who employed food tasters because they assumed there was poison in every meal. Their bedrooms were sealed up tight with multiple locks and sometimes traps, just in case someone got bold enough to try breaking in while they slept. The most cautious took it further, sleeping in different rooms each night or using decoy beds. Surrounding yourself with sycophants and backstabbers tends to make you suspicious of literally everyone. Assassins didn't just have to navigate the physical barriers. They had to outmatch the spiraling paranoia of someone who knew they were a walking target. The irony is, even after all this planning, sometimes the only way to reach a target was just dumb luck. Sure, you'd position yourself, maybe bribe a chambermaid or charm your way through a suspicious but uninterested guard. You'd think of every possible angle and backup plan, but at the end of the day, success boiled down to whether or not the timing was perfect. The target slipping up for just a split second could be the difference between victory and failure. A room unguarded during a moment of drunken distraction, or a forgotten servant's door left unlocked. These were the cracks anyone trying to infiltrate would pray for. And cracks that small didn't appear often. But let's say you did get the opening you needed. After weeks of planning, sitting through mind-numbing boredom, disguised as the quiet guy sweeping the floors, your chance arrives. One shot. That's it. The high stakes didn't leave room for nerves. You had to act precisely and quickly, because if that moment slipped through your fingers, you didn't just lose the job, you lost your life. If you failed to finish the job before being discovered, you'd be hauled out for what came next, a very loud, very public example of what happens to hired killers. Failure didn't just mean death. It meant executions so gruesome they'd be talked about for years. Whether it was hanging, drawing, quartering, or something even less pleasant, the idea was clear. Don't try this again. It didn't matter if you were remorseful or desperate. The audience wasn't there for nuance, so why do it? Why take on jobs with a near impossible chance of success? In many cases, the answer was the same: money, survival, and maybe the hope of a better life, though that last one feels bitter when you think about it. The jobs may have ended in success or failure, but they almost never ended with true security. And for the few who survived long enough to reflect, they found themselves isolated, tethered to a profession that demanded more detachment than any one person should endure. But wait, many of these killers didn't just fight guards, walls, and paranoia. They also had to worry about getting cheated out of payment. What happens when you risk death for a bag of coins, only to find betrayal waiting instead? Let's get into the grim reward system these unlucky souls depended on. A pouch of silver. Sounds like a decent deal for risking your life, right? Except, of course, that bag of coins was as slippery as the trust between assassins and their clients. The promise of payment was the carrot dangling in front of anyone desperate enough to take up this grim work. And yet, it was rarely as simple as finish the job, collect the coin. Payment wasn't just a reward. It was a tool of control, exploitation, and, more often than not, outright betrayal. Here's how it was supposed to work. An assassin would meet with a client in hushed secrecy, maybe in the corner of a smoky tavern or down a quiet alley after dark. The client, a noble, maybe a merchant with too many enemies, would bring a small pouch of silver to seal the deal. But it was rarely the full payment. Usually, they'd slap down a small advance and promise the rest when the job is done. Those 4 words carried a lot of weight, but very little clarity. What did done mean in a world full of dangerous grey areas? Did you have to provide proof? Did they want the rival gone quietly? Or did it need to be a public spectacle? Ironically, that vague language left plenty of room for excuses not to pay up later. And let's not forget that advance payment often wasn't enough to cover basic preparation. If someone handed you a few silver coins up front, it wouldn't stretch far. Not when you might need to bribe servants, slip past guards, or leave town in a hurry once the job was complete. In many cases, assassins had to dig into their existing resources, assuming they had any, just to survive long enough to finish the task. So when the final payday rolled around, it wasn't extra. It was barely getting them back to where they started. And that's if the client even intended to pay all of it. Here's the truth that shaped every negotiation. Assassins were easy to discard. Why hand over a hefty bag of silver to someone who, with the snap of your fingers, could be erased? Some clients made it a habit never to pay in full, working off the assumption that an assassin wasn't in a position to negotiate. After all, who's the lord of the manor going to believe? The wealthy baron claiming no such arrangement was made, or the dirty stranger holding a bloody dagger? Clients knew assassins operated outside the boundaries of law and honor, which made them practically untouchable in disputes over payment. Sometimes, the final betrayal was more sinister. Let's say you're an assassin, handing over proof of your success. Maybe a stolen ring or a message carved hastily into wood. The client smiles, nodding approvingly, says, "You've done well." And then, you notice the subtle glint of more blades in the room. Turns out, they'd hired someone else to clean up the mess entirely, including you. Why go through the trouble of paying a killer when it's easier and cheaper to get rid of them altogether? Clients didn't need loyalty. They needed plausible deniability. Eliminating the assassin wasn't just efficient, it was insurance. There's no risk of you talking about what you did if you're inconveniently deceased. Even when betrayal wasn't part of the plan, money itself became its own cruel irony. First, let's talk numbers. The most common payment was silver, occasionally a bit of gold if the client was particularly wealthy or desperate. A pouch of silver might sound generous until you consider how far it actually went. During the Middle Ages, 5 silver coins could buy a working man a decent horse, but not much else. After covering the cost of fleeing the scene, bribing informants, and possibly treating injuries, what little was left wouldn't stretch far. And gold, forget it. Gold wasn't handed out casually in a world where its value outweighed most people's entire existence. So while assassination might have been dangerous, it wasn't lucrative. You weren't banking enough to escape your day-to-day struggles. You were barely scraping by. Survival, however, came with its own hidden costs. Finishing a job didn't mean heading home and stashing your silver. It meant leaving, packing up whatever belongings you could carry, walking away from whatever life you'd built, and starting over in a place where no one recognized you. New names, new stories, new disguises. Each mission erased part of who you were, leaving behind scraps of false identities scattered across different cities, each one more fragile than the last. Relocation wasn't just necessary to keep running from enemies. It was also a way to avoid becoming a familiar face in a world that rarely forgot a bad reputation. Medieval economics only worked against them. Money couldn't fix the stigma of being a known assassin, which limited where you could hide and trade. And in cities where trust was a rare commodity, suspicions followed you everywhere. Even currency itself had its complications. Coinage varied wildly depending on where you were, and an unfamiliar coin could immediately mark you as an outsider. Do too much damage in one city, and you'd need to ditch all identifiable wealth just to keep from being traced. The problem was compounded by how little autonomy assassins had in choosing their work. Clients dictated the terms, set the targets, and pulled the strings. The assassin, on the other hand, had zero leverage. If they even attempted to argue for better pay or ask for protection afterward, it was seen as insolence, an invitation for the client to offer them a quick death instead. You couldn't push back. The power dynamic didn't allow it. Every interaction took place with an unspoken threat hanging in the air, something the assassin always knew, but rarely had any way to counter. When the job is done, didn't just promise payment, it promised the end of a transaction one way or another. Even the rare times assassins managed to collect their full payment, a heavy question still loomed. Was it worth it? Sure, the client might toss you a heavier pouch than expected, give you a smug pat on the back, and tell you the job was handled brilliantly. But what now? You couldn't stay nearby. Risk of exposure and retaliation was too high. You couldn't bank that silver on a safe, steady future. Your profession meant constant movement, constant change, and constant paranoia. Every coin in that purse came with the knowledge that someone else was probably already tracking your movements. For most assassins, the only real consistency, the only thing they could truly count on, was survival, if they even had that. Payment wasn't guaranteed, protection wasn't an option, and loyalty wasn't a concept in their world. Even when a mission ended with a perfect kill and a full payout, the risks didn't evaporate. They multiplied. The money might buy you temporary comfort, a warm meal or a room with a bed, but it couldn't erase the isolation, the reputation, or the simple fact that no amount of silver was worth dragging a target into the grave, knowing you might join them there. And then there's the grim irony of the so-called reward. After taking on impossible odds, dodging betrayal at every turn, and walking away, if they were lucky, with a handful of silver, assassins were simply expected to vanish again. They couldn't stick around and enjoy the fruits of their labor, if you can even call it that. The cost of doing business was not just measured in betrayal or coins. It meant giving up any shot at stability, belonging, or peace of mind. The shadow they became wasn't just a disguise, it was their entire existence. But what happens to the rest of their lives if survival keeps them moving for long enough? How does a person carry on a career like this, isolated, hunted, and trapped in a non-stop cycle of violence and invisibility? Let's take a closer look at what it meant to live with nothing but shadows for company. No guilds, no allies, no one to trust. Just shadows and silence. That was the life of a medieval assassin. Isolation wasn't just an occupational hazard. It was the entire foundation of the job. To survive in a world built on paranoia and betrayal, assassins had to stay hidden, stay secretive, and stay far, far away from any kind of connection. Relationships, whether with friends, lovers, or even other criminals, weren't just a luxury they couldn't afford. They were outright dangerous. Secrecy wasn't just their greatest weapon, it was their only true companion. Being alone protected them. The fewer people who knew their identity, the longer they lived. Anonymity was their armor, but it also came at a devastating cost. Imagine never being able to trust anyone, not even for a second. Never leaning on a friend or confiding in a partner because, deep down, you knew that all it would take was one slip of the tongue, one wrong guess, for everything to fall apart. Your life wasn't just lonely, it had to stay lonely. The irony, though, is that the same isolation keeping them alive also made their existence nearly unbearable. Let's take medieval villages, for example. These tiny, tightly woven communities didn't make it easy to blend in. Most people knew each other by name, or at least by face, making strangers stand out immediately. An assassin, already doing their best to avoid suspicion, couldn't afford to linger anywhere too long. One wrong interaction, a servant noticing you were just a little too quiet, or a farmer wondering why you seemed too well fed for someone dressed in rags. And suddenly, the whispers would start. Worse yet, people feared what they didn't understand, and assassins practically radiated suspicion. It wasn't just that they were outsiders. They were seen as cursed, unholy, the kinds of people who whispered to demons or dabbled in dark magic. This reputation wasn't easily shaken. Even rumors of assassin-like behavior could lead to accusations or even violence. Let's say there'd been a sudden death in town. A man falls from a wall, or a local noble collapses after dinner. People didn't need proof to conclude there had been foul play. Assassins, to most medieval minds, weren't just professional killers. They were practically walking bad omens. That level of superstition made it nearly impossible for them to settle down anywhere. They were always moving, always watching, and always scanning the horizon for the next person who might turn paranoid eyes their way. And speaking of eyes, even within the criminal world, assassins couldn't seem to catch a break. You'd think the company of thieves or smugglers would give them some sort of camaraderie, a shared sense of danger or rebellion. Not quite. Assassins were considered liabilities, even among the worst kinds of criminals. A thief might rely on another thief for a heist, but hiring, or even befriending, someone with such a high-risk reputation was asking for disaster. Nobody wanted to have their face associated with the killers, if it meant a mob with pitchforks might come knocking in the middle of the night. This meant assassins were entirely on their own. No allies, no support systems, and none of those legendary brotherhoods we like to imagine. The whole idea of secret assassin guilds, pure fiction. Outside the tavern whispers, there was no organized safety net for killers. No network of shadowy figures exchanging tips or connections. They were entirely self-reliant, which made them resourceful, but also incredibly vulnerable. Without a group to back them up, even minor mistakes could spiral out of control. If you were unlucky enough to get cornered, there wasn't a secret handshake or some underground system to bail you out. It was just you, your wits, and maybe whatever stolen knife you had in your pocket. Because of that, assassins couldn't form friendships or partnerships, even with other assassins. Let's say two killers cross paths. What happens next? Do they trust each other? Work together? Hardly. Each one would immediately assume the other was there to kill them. Solitude worked because it was safer. Getting close to someone, whether it was another criminal, a friend, or even a romantic partner, opened far too many doors to betrayal. Imagine your closest companion suddenly realizing who you really were and deciding the ransom for your name was worth more than your friendship. That's the kind of paranoia assassins had to carry with them everywhere. Even in the rare moments when connection seemed possible, reality quickly set in. Let's say an assassin, exhausted by years of travel, managed to strike up a romance. Maybe they found a partner willing to turn a blind eye to late nights, unexplained bruises, and the occasional bloodstain on their tunic. But curiosity always won out eventually. Questions like, "Where were you last night? What do you really do for work?" would bubble to the surface over time. The truth is, no real relationship could withstand the constant facades, the lies, and the growing personal risks. Emotional connections weren't just inconvenient. They were a direct threat to survival. The pressure to erase themselves wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. Assassins perfected the art of disappearing, both socially and literally. They avoided inns and taverns if they could, and when they couldn't, they'd pick the darkest corner of the room, always with their back to the wall, never lingering in one place long enough to leave an impression. Even their names were temporary. Many operated on a system of aliases, cycling through identities until their real name became meaningless. Every detail about them, from how they moved to what they wore, was calculated to make them seem unremarkable, forgettable, completely invisible. The goal wasn't to leave a legacy. It was to fade into the crowd so completely that history erased them without a trace. It wasn't just about blending in, though. Escaping suspicion meant understanding human behavior in ways most people never needed to. Assassins had to read people constantly. The way their eyes shifted, the tone in their voice, the hesitation in a handshake. This constant hyper-awareness wasn't just mentally exhausting. It was isolating. Trying to outthink everyone around you all the time meant you could never fully relax. It's hard to enjoy companionship when you're constantly calculating whether the person sitting next to you might try to kill you. And even when they tried to escape their isolating existence, societal stigmas dragged them right back. You couldn't just turn off a reputation like that. On the rare occasion that an assassin decided to leave the life behind, they couldn't exactly settle into a quiet countryside cottage and bake bread for the local fair. Any attempt to integrate into normal life would risk someone recognizing them. A merchant who saw them passing through years ago, or a servant who spotted their face flickering in lamplight. If even one person pieced together their hidden identity, the house of cards collapsed, forcing them to pack up and vanish yet again. This constant erasure, the endless need to move, to watch, to stay anonymous, took its toll. For most assassins, there was no endgame. Survival itself was the only reward, and even that wasn't guaranteed. The legacy they left behind wasn't one of glory or wealth, but rather silence. No stories written, no names etched into stone. If you succeeded as a medieval assassin, your job wasn't to be remembered, it was to disappear. But of course, what happens when they couldn't vanish? When one slip, one crack in their carefully guarded armor, brought all that isolation to a brutal and very public end? For assassins, failure didn't just mean death, it meant becoming the ultimate cautionary tale. Let's talk about what happened when a job went wrong and the shadows weren't enough to save them. One mistake. That's all it took. Not just to fail the mission, but to turn your life into the latest episode of public medieval theatre. Imagine this. You slip up. Maybe you're spotted before you even reach your target. Maybe you hesitate for half a second and the guards react. Or worst of all, maybe you complete the job, but it's messy, and someone lives to tell the tale. Whatever the cause, failure meant the end, and it wasn't going to be quiet, quick, or clean. It would be a show for everyone. The medieval justice system didn't believe in subtlety when it came to punishments, especially if you were someone who dared to operate outside of society's rules, like an assassin. Caught in the act or turned in after a botched attempt, you didn't just face execution, you faced obliteration. Your life, your identity, whatever reputation you thought you had, erased in one brutal public display designed to make you an example. Sound excessive? Sure. But it wasn't just about punishing you. It was about sending a message to everyone else who might have been considering a similar path. Miss the mark on your target, and the whole dynamic shifts. Suddenly, you're no longer the hunter. You're the hunted. Your invisibility, the very thing keeping you alive, collapses the moment someone points a finger your way. Descriptions of your height, build, or even the cut of your cloak spread fast through taverns, marketplaces, and courts. Crude sketches might not have captured your exact likeness, but they didn't need to. Combined with the buzz of rumor, it was enough to keep village eyes sharp and guard patrols tighter than ever. And here's the worst part. Failure didn't just make you vulnerable to the target's wrath, it also put you at risk from the person who hired you. That's the thing about medieval clients. They didn't exactly handle disappointment gracefully. The moment you failed, you became a liability. Loose ends were dangerous, and you were the loosest end of all. Maybe the client worried you'd expose their involvement, or maybe they figured putting out another contract, this time on you, was cheaper than tying up legal witnesses or cleaning up political fallout. Despite all the cunning and calculation it took to be an assassin, failure stripped that illusion of control in an instant. You were forced to flee, knowing full well that betrayal was already in the air, coiling around you like smoke. But if you didn't make it far enough, and let's face it, most didn't, the real horror began. When medieval authorities captured an assassin, the proceedings almost felt rehearsed. First came the interrogation, where any names you hadn't already burned into memory disappeared the moment the hot irons, racks, and skin-pulling instruments made their appearance. Torture wasn't just about gathering information, though. It was as much about spectacle as the execution itself. The goal wasn't simple justice, it was humiliation. The audience didn't just see you as a criminal. They saw you as broken, stripped of every shred of the mystique that always seemed to surround assassins in whispers. Then came the execution. Let's not sugarcoat it. Medieval punishments had all the subtlety of a battering ram. Forget a quick swing of the sword or one noose around the neck. Those were for royalty or criminals who hadn't insulted the balance of power. For someone like you, the methods were as varied as they were horrifying. Hanging wasn't the clean drop you might imagine. Instead, Bodies might be allowed to dangle and suffocate as the crowd gathered. Alternatively, burning was a popular choice, slowly turning the accused from person to charred silhouette, while onlookers murmured, half horrified, half fascinated. And then there was the wheel, an especially theatrical favorite. Criminals were tied down and beaten, their bones shattered one by one, all to prolong the agony and maintain the audience's attention.
These punishments weren't just violent. They were performances.